Just get going. Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining me on the ODAT Chat podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Ooh, I am so excited. I know I say that all the time, but it feels authentic every time.
Yes, yeah. So it's a mark of a good podcaster. They're excited to talk
Oh,
to each
really?
guest. Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
That means a lot to me coming from you. You're co-hosting The One You Feed, which is an amazing podcast. I was so excited when I got the email. It's like, hey, you want to interview Eric? I was like, oh, I dare not hope. And here you are.
Here I am.
Here you are. So I just have to start and ask you, what is it like to have 15 million downloads of your podcast?
First, it's wonderful. I mean, it's wonderful that the show has been able to touch as many people as it has, that it's been able to help as many people. I'm fortunate now where the show's grown to the point where that and my coaching work is what I do for a living. I feel very extraordinarily fortunate in that. That took me about 4.5 years to get there.
Okay.
But so I feel very fortunate in that way. And then at the same time, having 15 million downloads is like most things in life, right? We get used to our current reality, right? And if we're not careful, we take it for granted. And so that's the challenge, right? Is to wherever we are with whatever we have, is how do we not take it for granted, and how do we be grateful for it?
Right.
Because there's a lot of people who are thinking of starting a podcast who look at you and go, what must it be like to host, the ODAT podcast? Seriously, there are, that are really looking at where you're at. And so I think it's, like I said, that's the wonderful and challenging thing about being a human is we grow adapted to almost anything. And that's really good news when what we're growing adapted to are painful situations, right? We can get used to difficult circumstances. But the flip side is, of course, if we're not careful, we start taking the good things in our lives. We become completely habituated to them. And we're like, yeah, whatever, 15 million downloads. It's, we have to watch for that.
Hilarious.
I do anyway, for sure.
Yeah, no, that's such a good lesson in life. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dan Millman. He wrote The Way of the Peaceful Warrior.
Yes.
And he talked about the rules for being human. And one of them was there is no better than here, because once you get there, you just find a new there and strive towards that. But it's so interesting because I've been kind of obsessed lately with this idea of all the different ways we use to disassociate from the present moment, from who we think we are, because I think and this is why I love the premise of your podcast, The One You Feed, and I'll actually ask you to explain that. But it's I live by this idea that what you think about, you bring about, right? Like, what are we focusing our attention on, and what do we value, and all that. So it's just amazing to me, all the different ways we distract from the present moment, and we forget about all the good things that we really are. So I love that you focus on that. And do you want to just share with my audience about The One You Feed, the parable that you start each podcast with?
Sure. And, people in recovery may be familiar with this because I heard it in 12-step rooms is where I first heard it
Me too.
But it's a parable that goes like this. There's a grandfather who's talking with his grandson. He says, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. The grandson stops and thinks about it for a second. And he looks up at his grandfather. He says, well, grandfather, which one wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. So that's the parable. And so we use that as a jumping off point with each of our guests. So I start the show by reading that parable to each of our guests and say, hey, what does that mean to you in your life and in the work that you do?
That's amazing. And I was looking at your list of guests that you've had on your podcast, and listen, it's like the who's who of the healers of the world. why don't we do Emmy? Like, why don't we have like an Academy Award for teachers, healers? Because if there were, you would have like you would have like all the Academy Award recipients. You've had
Good
Don Miguel
fortune.
Ruiz, Simon Sinek, Tara Brock. Oh my gosh, I love her.
Yeah. Yeah.
Father Richard Rohr, Gabor Mate. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name right, but he is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
we've been very fortunate to have a lot of really wonderful guests. It's been that's been a joy for sure. And you mentioned Dan Millman. Dan was one of our first guests,
oh,
and I was blown away by the fact that he was willing to come on a show that didn't exist at that point. Like we were just starting, and I
wow.
wrote him a really heartfelt email because that book for me was a huge, the Way of the Peaceful Warrior was like boom, it kind of was a really big thing to me. And so yeah, when Dan agreed to come on very early on, I was just like, wow, so generous. And so yeah, we've been very blessed with the people that we've been able to have on.
Yeah, no, that is amazing. I didn't realize, I didn't even see that he was one of your, you've done so many episodes now. How
Yeah,
many episodes are you in?
280 some probably at this point. Yeah, I mean, even the podcast feed you get doesn't even go back to the beginning anymore because you can only put so many out there in a feed at a time. And so all of them are available on the website, but those early ones like Dan Millman aren't there. You got to go to the
Wow.
website for them.
I'm
So
so glad that's magical that that actually even came up. I didn't realize. I'm gonna have to go back and
yeah,
dig your
he's
archives.
extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I'm not sure. I think it was after I got sober that I read that book, and it really I had the same it had the same effect on me where it just really changed the way I thought about my approach to life. And that's one of the things that I've loved about recovery is all the teachers that I've discovered since I started this journey. um, do you want to just maybe highlight some of your most favorite teachers?
Sure. I mean, that question is a little bit like being asked, "Who's your favorite child?"
Who's your favorite kid? Yeah,
I'm
that's
not
true, and that's not really fair, but
no, but it's fair. I can give a few answers to that, right? I mean,
mhm.
so there were one very early episode was with a guy named Mike Scott, who's he's a musician. He's the lead guy from a band called the Water Boys, and I had been a fan of the Water Boys since I was like 15, like super fan. So
Wow.
having him come on, and again, that was pretty early. It was probably in our first 20 episodes. Having him come on was just such a moment for me,
Yeah.
to have somebody that you'd looked at that long. So that was a really big one for me. Trying to think of other ones. The ones that I do in person tend to stand out to me. There's just something about being able to do it in person. And so, a person we've interviewed more than anybody else is a spiritual teacher, Adyashanti. Um,
Yes.
and I've done those at his Open Gate Sangha in San Jose, California, and those have been really special for me.
Uh-huh.
Just to sit down in person with him and do those, and there just seems to be a connection. He and I have a connection. You could
Wow.
just, I'm sure you have a connection with all guests, but some you just really resonate with, and so those have been really, really important ones to me also.
I didn't realize he was in San Jose. I just moved from there.
Oh, okay, yeah, I saw
Oh,
your
wait.
San Francisco. Your 49ers jersey.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're doing this on
Really
video too.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah, 49ers, yay. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Yeah, it's so interesting when I've had experiences where I have spent years studying somebody's teachings and following them and listening to all the content that they put out. And then you have a conversation with them and you're like, whoa, this is a real person. It's
Right.
just,
Yeah. It makes me I was having this conversation with someone the other day about spiritual teachers, and he was saying, he was saying something about, I mean, we see a lot come up with spiritual teachers, right? You just see like lots of bad behavior come out of spiritual teachers, just like you do out of everybody, right? I
sure.
mean, bad behavior is everywhere. But to reference Adi Ashanti again, he sometimes says, if you want a perfect spiritual teacher, find the dead one.
I just had one.
Because
Right? Oh my
you
goodness.
can project whatever you want onto the dead. Living people will they'll do things that living people do,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
make
We're all
mistakes
human.
and be fallible. And it is interesting because I think we have a tendency, one thing that interviewing 280 people, a lot of whom, like you said, might be considered on the who's list of, you know, healers out there, is you realize that they are just ordinary people. And despite
Mhm.
all their wisdom, they suffer like we suffer. You know,
Yeah.
like that we don't get to be exempt from
Right.
life. And I think that's what so many of us want out of a spiritual teacher or out of spiritual lessons, is we want to be exempt from life being hard, life being painful. And none of us get that.
Right. There is sort of this illusion that if I do what the teacher says, then my life will be free of suffering. If I do all the meditations, the journaling, all that stuff, that I won't experience pain. And what I've realized, especially recently, and it's a lesson that's repeated for me, is that the goal is not, for me, is not to be absent of suffering, but to sort of lean in and try to learn what is it trying to teach me.
Hmm.
And so instead of resistance, it's the exact opposite of what my knee-jerk reaction is, which is to embrace it,
Yeah,
and
I
try to.
agree. I mean, I think there are a few different things from what you said there. One of them is, I make a distinction, and I'm not alone in making this. It's not like I came up with this, but between suffering and pain, right? And pain is
Mhm.
inevitable in life. You're going to get a headache. You're going to get sick. You're going to die. The people you love are going to get sick. They're going to die. You're not going to get things you want. You're not going to get the things you want. You're going to get things you don't want. It's inevitable. Suffering can be thought of as what we layer on top of it,
Mm.
right? So just like, I use this as an example. Sometimes I have back pain, right? So I have back pain. So, okay, that's the pain. But when I get the back pain and I start saying like, oh, why me? Why do I have to have back pain? Or I start to say, God, I'm too young for back pain. What am I going to be like when I'm 70? you know or I start thinking I'm never going to be able to do all the things that I want to do. All that stuff is a mental thing that I've layered on top of the back pain, right? And that's the suffering. And there's a phrase out there I've used on the show a lot, which is that suffering equals pain times resistance, like you just said.
Oh, that's
So
good.
I've got this painful situation. To the extent that I resist it, do I make it worse? And a lot of times I think with pain, and this does not sound like it would go in the healer's hall of fame, right? But sometimes with pain, my goal is just not to make it any worse. And as recovering people, we know what it's like to take pain and make it worse. We took
Oh,
it
yeah.
kind of to a pretty far extent, right? We took it kind of, like, all right, I don't like this feeling, so I'm going to change it and thus make it worse, right? And so a lot of times, I'm like, if I can just get by with the pain that life hands me without adding a bunch of suffering to it, I think I'm doing pretty good. And I think that's what a lot of the spiritual teachings point to. I think that's what Buddhism points to. A lot of these things. It's not that we get to a point where we don't feel anything. In a lot of cases, it's not the freedom from feeling things, it's the freedom to feel things.
Mm.
We had a guest on a long time ago, a guy named David K. Reynolds. Dan Millman actually considers him an influence on him. And David K. Reynolds wrote a book called Constructive Living. And it would resonate with, a lot of people in AA because in AA, our 12-step programs, we focus a lot on action. But he said something that really floored me. And he said, when we're in control of our behavior, we can allow ourselves to feel our emotions fully. And I went, whoa. Because when I was not in control of my behavior, emotions were scary things.
Oh, yeah.
What's going to happen when I get a negative emotion? Am I going to go drink? Am I going to get angry? Am I not going to go to work? Am I what suffering am I going to add to the pain? But when I know that I'm in control of my behavior, I have the freedom to allow emotions to do what they need to do, which is come, be there, be felt, teach me something, and move on. And
Oh,
that
that
was
is
really
so good.
profound to me. And so when I do that, when I stop looking for life to be perfect, and I just start, sort of not resisting, not resisting. I did a spiritual habits workshop several months ago, and we'll probably do it again. But one of the principles was, allow everything to be exactly the way it is. It's like, how do I stop resisting? And we talk about this in recovery. What is it, page 449, right? Acceptance, I guess it is.
Used to be 449.
I'm a little out of date with it, but
I know it messes me up too because I was totally ingrained.
yeah. But and I don't believe, I don't believe acceptance is the answer to all our problems. I actually think the Serenity Prayer kind of nails it, right?
Right.
There's we change, but I do think that this this constant motion of I don't like what's here, I want it to be something different.
Mm-hmm.
That that's the part of the human condition that the more we can work with skillfully, the better off we are.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. That's amazing. I want to come back to this idea of, you know, controlling our behavior because um, that is really something that people struggle with early on in recovery. And it's typically all about the drugs or alcohol. It's like, how do I stop doing that?
Yeah.
And I think you and I understand that it's not about the problem. The solution has nothing to do with the problem. It's all about um, really at the end of the day, it's about self-love. And there's many ways to, strategies to learn how to love ourselves again and accept ourselves exactly as we are, accepting our human experience. But I'm so curious, typically we start with the addiction story. We kind of jumped ahead to solution. But I would love to hear, how addiction has affected your life and how you were able to, start changing those behaviors. It's very, I think a lot of my audience is in that spot of, I want to change my behaviors. I do want to control my behaviors. And how do I break the addiction? I always feel like it's helpful to hear like where people came from. I'm so curious about,
Mhm.
like what was your family like? Like what did your dad do for a living? Like, did you have siblings and all that stuff? Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Sure, I'm happy to share that. What did my dad do for a living? He was in management, supply chain management of different sorts. So nothing that seemed glamorous then nor now, particularly. Although that's not to say I've done those kind of jobs, and
Sure.
so, I've got a younger brother and a younger sister. My parents divorced when I was about 13, and
Ooh, rough age.
I was a troubled kid from, by the time I was about 9, I was kind of consistently in trouble. I was a kleptomaniac by the time I was 10, vandalism, breaking and entering. I just was always kind of in trouble. Um, and so, and I think I had two parents who were very unhappy together. I had a mom who had and still has, I would say probably major depressive disorder. I had a father who I think has it also. His turned, his was less looked at the time less like depression and looked more like anger. But I've since learned that's a common thing in men.
Hmm.
It comes out as irritability. So it wasn't a real happy place to be, and I don't think I was very happy in it. And so, I spent my early years being kind of in a lot of trouble. Um, yeah, that's the summary of them in a nutshell.
What happened after your parents divorced when you were 13? Who did you live with?
I lived with my mom,
You did, yeah. Where did you grow up?
Columbus, Ohio.
Ohio. Oh, yeah, that's where you did your TED Talk in Ohio,
It is
right?
where I still live. I still live in Columbus. I mean, I lived in California for a while, lived in New York for a while, but most of my life's been in Columbus, and I actually really like it there. Although I now split my time between Columbus, Ohio, and Atlanta, Georgia. So um, I sort of have two homes now, which is not ideal. But
Oh, which is not ideal. Why do you do it?
my girlfriend or my partner, her mother has Alzheimer's, and her mother
Oh,
lives in Atlanta. So we do live-in care 2 weeks a month down here. And
oh,
then
got
go
it.
to Columbus where my mom is, and she's not real well, and so we go there and help take care of her. So we're kind of back and forth. It's just that season of life for us right now.
I was just gonna say you and I are kind of at that age where our parents get older and then we're responsible.
Yes.
Thank God we're sober. We can do those things.
Yeah.
Um, so when did addiction become an issue for you? Did you start using early?
Not really. I used a few times in high school, and I used strangely, but not often. And it wasn't really a problem. And then my last 2 years of high school, I started a tutoring program for disadvantaged children, a nonprofit. It started a nonprofit organization that was a tutoring program for disadvantaged children. And I got my first glimpse, actually, of what caring for, doing for others, service work, not being so focused on myself did. And those were really good years. All my other years were really challenging years. Those 2 years were pretty good years. Um, and when I started doing that, I saw what drugs and alcohol were doing to the kids in those families. And so I just sort of said, no more. I'm not going to do it at all. And, but when I was 18, my girlfriend broke up with me and started dating my best friend. And I sort of,
Oh,
yeah, I know. I sort of fell apart. And someone
was
one
that your
night
first
said,
heartbreak?
no, it wasn't my first, but it certainly was the
Ugh,
worst.
the worst, yeah.
Not the worst ever, but the worst at that age. Um,
Hmm.
and somebody one day said, here, why don't you just have a drink? And I said, why not? I don't care. And it was like, that was when, the proverbial switch flipped in me. And I was like,
Sure.
this is magic. And, and I was just off to the races. I was off to the races for the next 6 years. I got sober at partway through being 24, and by that point, I was a homeless heroin addict who was,
Oh my
in a
God.
lot of, I had a lot of trouble with the law. I weighed 100 pounds. I had hepatitis C. I mean, I
Oh
was in
my
pretty bad
God.
shape. So that 6 years was a pretty fast acceleration. I feel like I took a drink one night and then drew a sober breath again, like 6 years later or something. It was a pretty fast and hard ride. Not that
Yeah.
there weren't wonderful parts of it, because of course it starts off that way, but by the end there was much wonder left in it.
Yeah. No, that's, how did you end up on heroin?
I was a musician, and I just joined a band, and I went, I would go to band practice, and I was always really messed up, drinking and marijuana, and I just was looking at these people like, these guys are in worse shape than me. Like, what are they doing? And sure enough, they were doing heroin, and I tried it one night, and I loved it, and that was
Yeah.
kind of defined the next few years of my life.
Wow. That's interesting that you saw these guys and you were like, wow, they're jacked up. How can I be that way?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Like, what do they know? I don't. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
What is so amazing? It's ruining their life. Um,
Right.
yeah, no, that's wow, that's crazy. So how did you stop using heroin and get
Um,
sober? What happened?
yeah, I got arrested. That helped. That contributed. I got arrested, and when I got arrested, when I said I was homeless, I guess I should be more specific. I was living in the back of a van that happened to be the van of the person I worked for. And so when I got arrested, the van went away, the job went away, the source of money went away, the source that I was stealing money from went away. And I had a really bad heroin habit, and I was like, I'm going to be really sick. And at that time, that was what I was most afraid of. And so I went into detox. And I had done that before. This was not the first time I'd tried to get sober. And when I was there, they said, you need to go to, we think you should go to our 28-day program. And initially just said, no, I don't, no, I don't need to do that. I'm not going to do that. I look back on, I'm like, what exactly why was where did I
I
think I
know.
needed to go? But at
Oh
the
no, no, not
time,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, but I went back to my room, and I had, we describe them sometimes as moments of clarity. And I think I had a moment of clarity that was like, I'm going to die if I go back out there.
Yeah.
Like, I just knew I was either going to die or I was going to go to jail for a long time. It just was really evident that I was at the end. Um, and so I went to that 28-day treatment program. That then eventually, I got out of that, and then chose to go, after a while, I went into a halfway house, and I just threw myself into 12-step recovery. And lo and behold, got sober.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's so funny because there's so many of us that have that extreme personality. We're kind of all or nothing. like our energy is so intense. But what's interesting is when it's channeled, it's like that beam is so strong and we can accomplish amazing things when we channel that energy.
Yes. Yep. And I that's a great way to describe it. And I think that's what happened is I just took
Yeah.
all that energy and I laser focused it on getting sober. And, and I have this conversation with people sometimes about, what got you sober? And it's such a mysterious question. It's such
Mhm.
a, because on one hand I could go, well, I got arrested and then I went to detox and then but people get arrested all the time. People go to
All the
treatment
time.
all the time. They don't get sober.
No.
And it's God's own mystery, really, to me. It
Yeah.
is the biggest mystery in life to me, why some of us get it and some of us don't. And if one of us could actually really answer that question, we'd be rich beyond all repair. Because if we could actually say, here's exactly how people get sober, here's how to make everybody get sober, you'd solve one of humanity's lifelong struggle. So there isn't an answer, but I started thinking about it and I sort of realized like, yeah, a bottom had something to do with it. But I
Mhm.
think the other thing that had a lot to do with it is that for whatever reason, that bottom coincided with hope.
Hmm.
I think both those things really had to be there.
Yeah.
Bottom alone is not enough, right? But for whatever reason, my bottom happened, and then shortly thereafter, whatever it was, I began to see like, oh, there's another life, there's a way out, and I began to believe that maybe it could happen for me. And I think when those two things came together, that was, at least for me, the fertile ground that sort of birthed recovery.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. The bottom plus hope. And but to go back to what you were saying about, if we could answer that question, well, I feel like everybody is so different and people get sober. There's so many ways that people get sober. I feel like it's almost like the question of like, who is God?
Yeah.
There is no answer to that, but the seeking of that question, the seeking of that answer to that question forces us to go sort of on this journey, and it's always a journey back to self and self-examination, exploration, and how do I, like, what is controlling the world? How do I control my own behavior, like you were talking about? And but it's in that seeking and struggling that we transform, right? So if we handed everybody this answer on a silver platter, do you see? Yeah, you see where I'm
No,
going with this?
I totally get it. I totally
Yeah.
get it. Yeah, that would not work. It's such a mystery and such a painful mystery why some people get it and some don't. It's just heartbreaking. And if
It
you're
is.
around long enough, you see real heartbreak.
Yeah.
You and I talked about before how, and we'll probably get to this. I stayed sober for a period of time, and then, I went back out, and I've been back about 13 years. But a lot of people who kind of came back in with me that second time, who had an amount of time, like I could think of three of them are dead and two others who they just can't get it. They had years of sobriety in AA,
Hmm.
5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and they went back out and they cannot get it again.
Yeah.
And it's just heartbreaking. I don't know, and I look at myself and I'm like, well, I don't fully know how I got through that. I don't know how I did it. I mean, I could tell you the steps I took,
Hmm.
but that doesn't seem to be the whole story.
It doesn't. It really is one of those great mysteries. Why is it so much harder the second time? I've seen that myself, and I have a very similar experience too. As a witness, I've been in the rooms a long time, just like you, and people don't always make it back. I mean, I've interviewed people who have since passed away, and not always from this disease, but yeah, I remember when I first got sober and I did the same thing you did with the 12-step groups. I didn't get to go to rehab. I'm a little jealous. I didn't know
Yeah.
that was a thing. But yeah, just that. I mean, it's just an amazing experience why some people get it and some people don't. But yeah, I like that idea of the bottom plus hope. I when I was introduced to the 12 steps, that was what what they said? They said, welcome home. And I was like, I could take a deep breath and like relax for the first time and realize
Yeah.
I could just, that y'all got my kind of crazy and that I could find a new normal
Yep.
and everything was going to be okay. There was that hope.
Yep.
So, what do you think? Why do you think you made the decision to start? Did you start drinking or well,
Mhm. Yeah.
okay.
So it's a little bit of it's a slightly convoluted story, but I'll try and make my way through it somewhat. So, several years after, so when I got sober, I had a girlfriend. We were heroin users together, and we had an on again, off again relationship. We separated early on in sobriety. We were told that was a good thing to do, and it turned out to thus be the case. But then we got back together, and we had a child together,
Okay.
and then she um, she chose to leave when my son was 2, and for a guy who was in AA that we knew, and I again had sort of a major heartbreak, and I did not drink then. But what happened was, I think when I got sober, I was I was sort of, we hear you have to have a spiritual life, God as we understand him, a higher power, and I just took the one that was offered, which was a God, this thing out there, God that sort of intervenes in our lives and does things for us, right? And I had but I didn't fully believe it, but I made myself believe it. But when
Mm,
my life really fell apart, I realized I did not have a spiritual life that I really deeply believed in and really propped me up.
mhm,
My spiritual life as I had it at that point did not know how to accommodate something like, oh, you can be in AA sponsoring lots and lots of people, really active, have all these service positions, and then your wife can leave you for someone else in AA when you've got a 2-year-old, and the rest of the world will just go on like nothing happened. Like, my spiritual life just couldn't accommodate it.
oh
Just,
my God.
it kind of broke it. It kind of
Mhm,
broke my, and so I didn't drink right away. I didn't drink for several years. But what I did do is I started drifting away from AA. But even more than that, I think what I did was I started really drifting back into very self-centered behavior. I
mhm,
became very focused on me. What about me? What about me? What about me? You know? Um, and so that just slowly led to, the thought started coming back, like, well, maybe you could drink. And I went, and it was very logical. It was like, well, you were doing heroin then. Like, that's a terrible idea. We all know that's a bad idea. Like, we're not going to do that again.
mhm.
And you've gone through so much therapy, and you've been to so many meetings. And look at your life now. You show up for work every day. You're more successful than you've ever been. You make good decisions about eating. You make good decisions about exercise. You make good decisions about how to raise your son. You, you were just young then, and you were doing heroin, and of course you had a problem. But now you'd be okay. And then I found out that my brother, who got sober off heroin about a year after me, had been drinking for about 6 months.
Oh, and he didn't
And
tell you?
nope. And he said, I'm doing fine. I'm doing great. And that was sort of the final straw in my, because I was like, oh, look, I thought it was this genetic thing, but my brother's doing it. He's fine. And so I just said, you know what? I'm
Oh,
going to drink again.
yeah.
And, the amazing part was that for a little while, nothing bad happened. I think in AA, at least when I was around in those days, we used to tell these stories. Like, if I take a drink, I'll be shooting heroin on the east side in 8 hours. Like, we're
Yeah.
so dramatic.
So dramatic.
If I take a drink, I'll be dead before the sun comes up. And I took a drink, and I was like, I had one
Oh,
beer and everything was fine.
nothing happened.
Nothing happened. And nothing happened for a while. But slowly but surely, the wheels started to turn. And I never went back to heroin, but I drank, and I smoked an enormous amount of marijuana. Um,
I thought you were going to say a little weed. An
yeah,
enormous amount.
an enormous amount, yes.
Okay.
Um, and, I eventually hit a point where what I was able to realize from having been sober before was that I was just as sick then as I was in the beginning.
Yeah.
I had a nice house in the suburbs. I had the best job I ever had. You know, I was driving a BMW. I mean, all the things that would make you go, look, things are fine here, right? Certainly not homeless in a van,
Right.
but inside, I knew that I was every bit as out of control as I had been when I was 24.
Yeah.
The substance was just different, right? And alcohol is a substance that you can carry. I think it's possible to carry on drinking for a lot longer than it is to carry on shooting heroin for for some
Yeah.
for some reasons that have everything to do with laws and nothing else, right? Alcohol is legal,
Yes.
heroin's not. Thus, heroin's very expensive. Thus, you have to do dangerous things to get it. I mean, all that stuff. And so,
Yeah.
you know, alcohol just I could have kept doing it. And I had for me what was a bottom, but in comparison to the previous bottoms, it was a flea bite, you know, but it
Right.
was
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
And I could see, like, I'm just as sick. I'm just as sick. I'm not doing the things I had to do then to get drugs, but I would,
Yeah.
right? If alcohol suddenly became illegal tomorrow, things would look very different.
Yeah.
Um, so that was enough for me to sort of come back. Although, like I said, it was really difficult coming back. That was a slog for sure. The first time felt like, I felt like grace, even though I don't necessarily believe in that concept exactly. It did feel like it felt pretty easy. Easy is the wrong word, but in comparison to what the second time was, it felt easy. And the first time I got to go into treatment and I got to go into a halfway house and it was all new. Every idea was brand new,
Yeah.
and there was so much hope. And the second time I was like, I know all this stuff, for God's sake, um, I did an interesting thing before I got sober the second time. I went to a program called Moderation Management. And it's a real program. It's a real program, and
Yeah.
it believes this, and I don't disagree with the fundamental tenet of it. The tenet of it is not everybody who's got a quote unquote problem with drinking is an alcoholic.
I
So
agree.
not everybody needs to go turn their life over in a 12-step program and go to a meeting every day the rest of their life.
Right.
For some of these people, they can choose to moderate. And we all know people like this, people that if you look at any college campus on any given night, on any given weeknight, you're like, 80% of this campus qualifies as alcoholic under the definition, right? They're blackout drinking,
Yeah.
but 99, but a vast majority of them will go on to drink socially years later, right? So I believe the premise. So I was like, I'm going to go to moderation management. I'm going to learn to moderate because I knew what was coming if I didn't. I knew what was coming with sobriety and abstinence. And I didn't, from the alcoholic mindset, that's the worst fate imaginable, right?
Abstinence. Yeah. Nobody wants that.
No, right. Why would you? And so I went to moderation management and I worked the hell out of that program. I took it so seriously and I couldn't do it.
Mm. Yeah.
Sometimes I could do it for like a night, but what I realized, and I kind of understood that line in the big book that says, we can't
Cannot
control
control or enjoy our drinking.
and I was like, I can sort of maybe control it, but when I do, it's misery.
Hmm.
Or I can just let go of the reins and sort of enjoy it. But there's no way I could do both. And the truth is I couldn't do either at that point, really. It wasn't enjoyable and I couldn't control it. But boy, the effort to try and control it was misery. I remember a lot of nights sitting at my downstairs sink. And it's like 11 at night. I got to get up at 6 in the morning to go to work. And I'm sitting there with a bottle of whiskey. And I'm like, just go to bed. There is no I'm going to go upstairs in 5 minutes and lay down in bed. There is no reason on God's green earth to take another shot. None. And yet I would lose that battle more often than I won. Like
Hmm.
I just couldn't. I was just, and it was misery. So, but the reason I bring that up is because it was really good for me when I got sober. Because I tried.
Yes.
I tried to moderate my drinking really hard. And it's a learning that I use often. I go back to it and I go, see, look, that did not work. So it was a useful exercise for me to do that. And I think, the big book sort of says that, like, if you're not convinced, go out and try and have a few drinks, see what happens,
Go
you
try
know?
moderation. Yeah.
And so it was a good experience for me.
Yeah, I just interviewed Dr. Adi Jaffe, and he wrote a book called The Abstinence Myth. And
Yeah.
you know, um, I did not agree. Listen, I understand that there, like you were saying, that there are some people who can moderate. That's all well and good. But for those of us who, I'll just say alcoholic just for simpler terms instead of trying to define the alcohol use disorder and go down that rabbit hole. Um, there are those of us who require abstinence for a healthy lifestyle? And I think that is such an important question to answer, is can I moderate?
Yes.
And I think I had people, and listen, I put a trigger warning on that episode that I published, that this is going to be a trigger warning because of what you were talking about. It's like people with long-term sobriety, that question comes up occasionally.
Yep.
It's, was I really, maybe I was just sick, the heroin thing. Maybe I was,
Yep.
I was 25 when I got some, maybe I was just young,
Mm-hmm.
look at me now. It's like,
Right. Right. Right.
and I think that is such an important question to answer, once and for all, is, can I moderate? And for me, the answer is no.
Yeah, no, it's for me too. And the interesting thing about moderation management as a program for me is, although the thing was like, this is for people who don't have that serious of a problem, what I found was moderation management was littered with alcoholics who just didn't want to face having to be sober.
You were still answering that
That,
question, which is,
that,
I think, yeah,
yeah, that's who was in there. And, yeah, I mean, I agree. It's very interesting because, once upon a time, I would have said abstinence is the answer for everybody who's an alcoholic, and that's it.
yeah,
Right.
me too.
And I don't believe that anymore. Although I do believe for most people who have a real addiction, abstinence is the way of life that is going to be easiest for them. But the idea of harm reduction has really gained a
Yeah.
lot of momentum in the
Hmm.
world, and it's a useful idea, right? And
Yeah.
and it's interesting because if you look at it and you go, well, let's take somebody who, let's just say, is a heroin addict and they use once a month now instead of every day. What do we
Casual heroin use, is that a thing?
Well, some people are able to, some people, I am always careful with this because with you, I think there's a trigger warning here. And I think that we will, like I said before, when I was sitting in active alcoholism, the thought of abstinence was the worst thing in the world
It's
because
so
you lose your
scary.
best friend,
Yeah.
right? You lose your best friend, even though your best friend isn't your best friend, but at the time you think your best friend is your best friend. But, but but this idea of harm reduction, and Gabor Mate talks a lot about this, a real expert in addiction, and he talks about, some people who are so damaged, is a reduction in use, you know the best those people can hope for. In AA they say, people who are incapable of being constitutionally uh,
Honest.
honest with themselves, right? Is there a class of people? And I think all this gets into a lot of gray area. Although I think for most people who would probably be listening to this show, and the vast majority of us, abstinence is the route that leads to the best quality of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and for those people, where harm reduction is useful, it still seems like it sets them on the path that's different than the one that they were previously on, which is destruction, right? So we go,
Yep.
harm reduction is, um, from a conclusion that's pretty predetermined to, harm reduction is like, that's where the possibilities
Right.
really lie. So there's multiple results on that path, right? And
Yep.
that's where we expose ourselves to new teachers and new ideas. And I think that's where we evolve to a better place. Whereas, there, really severe addictions, alcoholism and stuff like that, just lead to an inevitable, place of death and suffering and
Yep.
all bad
Yep.
things. So, um,
Being
yeah.
alive increases your chances of getting fully sober.
Yes, it does. And it's interesting because in all these things, it's like we talk about gray areas, but if and that's when we're speaking about people in general, in generalities, and because we're talking about people who are very different, right? But if we do a case study on the individual, like what's right or wrong for them becomes pretty clear when it's focused on just one person's set of circumstances. But that's why we need help from other people, because when we're in it, we can't see it. It's like that self-denial is so strong. We can't really see the clear-cut answers. We have all this emotion, and it's just my opinion that emotion obscures our perspective. And it's so easy to see someone from the outside. It's so easy for them to see what you need to do. It's because they're not clouded by emotion,
Yeah.
you
Yep.
know?
That's very well said. There's something called Solomon's paradox, and it talks about King Solomon, who, if we know King Solomon, right, we know he was known for being wise. We still hear the wisdom of King Solomon thousands
Hmm.
of years later, right? Well, and people traveled from all around the world to get King Solomon's wisdom. Well, apparently in his own life, the guy was kind of a basket case, right? So it's called Solomon's paradox.
Typical.
He was so wise, but he
Yeah.
couldn't do it for himself. And I think
Yeah.
we are all that way. We are all that way to some degree, for sure.
Yeah, we really do need each other. It's like everyone that I admire has somebody that they can lean on for support and clarity and to help them sort things out when they
Yep.
get emotional and can't and they lose all perspective. So,
Yep. And
um,
I think what you said there about gray areas, right? One of my favorite teachings of all time is the Buddha's teaching of the middle way. And I believe in almost everything in life, the middle way, avoiding extremes saves us from trouble. Except in my case, abstinence is not a middle way, but I mean, that's an exception to that rule, right?
yeah,
There's there's something there's something different about me. I don't know what it is. I don't know why it is, but so I'm a big believer in the middle way. I'm a big believer in gray areas, but I often say to people, you know, I love the clarity of none. There is a
yes,
great deal of clarity to none. you
yeah,
know when you get into should I, shouldn't I, how much, and you can do that with any, and
anything.
there's a great deal of clarity, and a lot of energy gets freed up.
Hmm.
One of the big things I teach people in my coaching program is is to separate decision from action, right?
Oh, tell me
Decide.
about that.
Well, yeah. So a lot of us, if we don't decide in advance what we're doing, then we are in the moment trying to decide what to do and then actually doing it. And that's really hard to do because in the moment, um, we're not very clear. Like you said, we're very obscured by emotion.
Hmm.
So the way I think of it is, I think of sort of a higher and a lower self. And we don't need to take this in any spiritual way or anything, but the higher self, I would say, is the self that can sit back and really think about what's important to me, what matters to me, what do I want to do with my life, what's the direction I want to go, what's good for me, what's bad for me, right? That higher self can do that. The problem is, then there's the lower self, and the lower self is the one that shows up day to day with us. It's the one that gets hungry. It's the one that gets angry. It's the one that gets tired. It's the one that sees a cupcake. It's right. And so there's a lot of benefit in stepping back and going, all right, what's important to me? What do I want to do? Who do I want to be? And deciding that. And then when the time comes, all you got to do is take the action. if if you try and do both at the same time, we tend to get confused. So for example, one of the things I talk a lot about, like, and this is very simple, anybody can learn from this. Like, if you want to build, let's just say, an exercise program, right? You are far more likely to do it if you say, all right, I'm going to exercise Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. and I'm going to do running, and I'm going to do it at Alum Creek, right? Your likelihood of doing that goes way up over, I'm going to run some more this week.
Right. Being specific. Yeah.
Most of us have vague intentions, but the specificity makes a huge difference. And that's sort of separating the decision from action, right?
Oh, I love that.
Um,
Separate decision from action.
yeah, it makes a huge difference in what you're trying to change. And AA actually kind of does a good job of this, because it's like, you're going to go Monday night to this meeting at this time at this place. Like, it's
Mhm.
clear, you know,
Yeah.
it's clear your way, and that's why, a home group, each week on a Tuesday night, here's where you're going to be. You've separated your decision from action, instead of going, well, should I go to a meeting today? Once we get into that debate, and so that's the clarity of none.
The
It's separating
clarity.
decision from action. I've decided I'm not doing that. you
Mm.
know and we all know what this, we can apply it to something like alcoholism, but we can apply it to things that are far more subtle, like eating. Like, I want to eat better. How many of us say that all of the time? I want to eat better. What does that mean? When
Yeah.
I'm out to dinner with my friends next week, does that mean I get dessert or I don't get dessert? If you
Right.
don't know the answer, 9 times out of 10, the dessert's coming, right? You know,
Amen. Yeah, it's
that,
true.
that's just the way it works. So separating decision from action is really helpful. And knowing that, like, I don't drink is a real clear, it's pretty clear at that point.
Yeah, super clear. I love that. And I have to comment on the eating. I heard your interview with the lady who talked about emotional eating. Was it
Yeah.
Julie Simon?
Hmm.
Yeah. I thought that was such a good one. I mean, that's one of the things that I think almost everybody struggles with, especially after 40.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. And, but it was interesting, and all these things that we're talking about, to me, in my mind, it always comes back to what are the strategies that we can use for like self-care. It's like, what is at the bottom of this? And of all the interviews that you've done, are you recognizing reoccurring themes?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of reoccurring themes. They're not very exciting. Um, I can't tell you the number of times that exercise, eating right, sleeping well,
Yeah.
spending time, connecting with people you love comes up,
Yeah.
meditating, those things are there, right? And it's one of the genius things, over the years I have drifted away from 12 step a little bit, and I have some challenges with 12 step. I also It saved my life, right? And
Yeah.
it's a wonderful thing in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I think is brilliant about 12 steps is it builds in some of those very principles. They're right there. The connection with others,
Yeah.
and so, but yeah, I mean, to me, I consider things like eating right and exercising and getting enough sleep and meditating. For me, those are like the foundations.
Absolutely. Do you journal too?
I don't, but I do a lot of reflection. I end up, I do the podcast, I create programs for people. I do a mini episode each week that I give to supporters of the show where I do like some sort of teaching. And so, I'm reflecting a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It sounds like you process out loud.
I do. Yes, that's a great way to say it. I do a lot of out loud processing. So yeah, I mean, for me, probably the fundamental one of those is exercise.
Mm.
But I've dealt with depression. I think I dealt with it when I was young. I deal with it now, and
Mhm.
that seems to be the single biggest sort of like depression helper for me. I wish it
Absolutely.
was an easier one. I mean, I really, I just think it's so boring to be like, it's like eat your vegetables. It's not very fun. Like it'd be much better if I could tell you about, carrying a crystal in a certain color back in your pocket. Like we'd all like that more.
Well, nobody wants to acknowledge that we already have the answer. We already have the answer,
Yep.
and nobody
Yep.
wants to do it. But they say that pain is the touchstone of all growth. And for me, it's like, I already had the answer. I had the answers when I was 6 years old, but I had to go through this whole process of suffering and addiction to be willing to get beat down enough to submit and surrender to what the answers are. And for me, it's kind of interesting to feel like I'm on this path that's, the path is beset with danger and death and really extreme things that if I don't stay on the beam and do the things I know that I have to do to take care of myself and evolve, feed the good wolf, right?
Yep.
That if I don't, the consequences for me are so severe that I have to. And so it's been sort of like the best, worst thing that ever happened to me. This whole, I just blanket everything under addiction, but
Right.
it's the best, worst thing that ever happened to me. It's, Ryan Holiday wrote this book called The Obstacle is the Way.
Yes.
And that sums up my recovery journey, so to speak, is that the thing that was the obstacle, it turned out to be the thing that saves me on the regular. Because even now, I've been sober a long time, but even now I'll skip my morning routine. I
Yeah.
pay for that shit all day long when I don't do it.
Yeah, no, it's true. It really does. How we take care of ourselves really matters. We started this conversation sort of saying, like, life isn't without pain. Life
Right.
isn't without challenge, but I think we can do our best to keep that more minimal, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's an ongoing process for me of what does that look like and how does that work, and how do we suffer as little as possible, and how do we take the pain that we have in life and, like you said, make it something positive.
Yeah. Make
i'm a
it
really
useful.
yeah, I'm a really big believer. I don't believe that everything happens for a reason. That's not my personal belief system. A lot of people have it. What I do believe, though, or I don't believe that everything happens for the best, but I do believe we can make the best out of everything that happens. And
I
I do
couldn't agree
believe
more.
that in every situation, there is a kernel of transformation in it. And
Hmm.
there are times there's nothing more annoying than being in a huge amount of pain and have somebody say, well, it's growth opportunity. It's like,
Want to
yeah,
stab you.
I'm going to put a fork in your forehead. Um, Although it is often helpful to remember that. Like
Yeah.
it is often helpful for me when I'm really suffering to go, oh, okay, this could lead to something better. But it's almost always true,
Yeah.
you know,
Absolutely.
and pain is a weird thing because you can't, my experience is I can't shortcut it.
Right.
I cannot add to it, and that's what we talked about in the beginning. I cannot make it worse, but I can't shortcut it. But I can also let it teach me and inform me. Somebody asked me the other day on a podcast, like, well, how much is your recovery from addiction sort of influenced who you are today? And I was like, that question doesn't register. Like, I could not begin to separate out who I would be
I know,
had I
right?
not gone through the addiction and the subsequent countless number of years in recovery. It's a question that just doesn't compute. I can't say, oh, it's about 60% of who. I mean, it's just baked into everything that
Yeah.
I do. And so, it is, and I think that's the thing that can be helpful when you're sitting at the very beginning. We talked about, recovery can happen when, a bottom and hope. And then I think the other piece of that is support, right? The right support. When
Oh,
those
for
three
sure.
things show up,
Yeah.
um, but a lot of times we sit at the beginning of this and we think, I've just got to get sober. It's miserable. It's awful. It's all that, right? And
Hmm.
the thing that going to 12-step groups or any sort of support group did for me is it made me go, like, those people seem like they're doing pretty darn well.
Hmm.
Like, this just isn't the relieving of a symptom. This is a transformation of who I am in a
Yeah.
really deep, profound, and beautiful way.
Yeah. I love that. Um, and I want to sort of transition a little, talk about transformation. I want to just shift gears a little bit
Yeah.
into talking about your coaching program, because I think it's so interesting. Sometimes these teachers that change our lives so deeply, they're sort of this self-imposed separation where we think, oh, but they're not accessible,
Mm,
right? But the
yeah.
truth of the matter is that you're somebody who is accessible. And why not work with somebody who not only has what you want, but they have what they want, right? I think that's kind of, you know
Wow, that's a great way of spinning that phrase that I've never heard before. Yeah.
Not great. Yeah, I didn't, that wasn't my idea, but I will totally pass that along to you. um, but yeah, so I know that you're accessible. So how do people work with you? Because you do one-on-one coaching. That's
I
right.
do, I do one-on-one coaching. The if you want to know how to find out about it, you can go to ericzimmer.coach, and learn more. But as far as what I do, I work with people on how to make a change. Typically people who've tried to make a change before and haven't been successful. So I work with people, And then I also generally work with people who sort of feel stuck and are going like, what's next? Like a lot of us, we hit this point in sobriety. We get a certain number of years, we've sort of worked the steps, and then it just all of a sudden feels like, well, now what?
Yeah.
You know, Bill Wilson called AA spiritual kindergarten, right? Like what's next,
Right.
So a lot of what I do is, so a lot of some of the stuff I do, like people are like, I want to build an exercise routine, or I hear that exercise and eating right and meditation are good for self-care, but you know what? I cannot be consistent at it.
Hmm.
Right. I get a lot of people coming to me who say, I'm the kind of person who can't stick with anything. I don't have any discipline. I can't finish anything. And I don't believe we are those kind of people. I believe that behavior change is a skill. I believe it's something you can learn. We learned how to get sober,
Right.
right? We went, and people who knew what they were doing showed us the path. And behavior change, I think, is very, very similar. So I don't buy like, oh, you're just undisciplined. You're just lazy. I think we just don't know how.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of science out there about how to do it. So I work with people who are trying to make changes like that. Like I want to get consistent about exercise and eating. I work with, authors who are trying to finish a book or start a book. I work with people who are launching businesses. Like, okay, I'm trying to launch this thing on the side, but I can't seem to put any energy into it. So whatever kind of change somebody wants to make is kind of what I work with people to do.
Breaking through to the next level. I love that. I might have to call you later. That's awesome. Well, listen, you've been so generous with your time. I can't wait to publish this so that people can get to know you and listen to your podcast and kind of hang out with you. I always encourage people I work with to, what was so helpful to me in early recovery was listening to Marianne Williamson cassette tapes, because there was
Yeah,
no such thing as a podcast
that's
back
right.
then.
No, not even close.
Right. But I recognized even then that if I was listening to something positive, that my inner critic didn't have any
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
So, and your podcast is absolutely amazing. I'm so grateful that I had an opportunity to come across it and hear more about your experiences with it. And I just have such a soft spot in my heart for people who are willing to, um, share the message. And I know it's a lot of work. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of everyone who loves you for doing all that work.
Well, thank you. You're doing the exact same work. So thank you. And I've really enjoyed talking with you. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. I hope to talk to you again soon. You have a great day.
You too.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good. Oh, listen, thank you so much. I didn't
Yeah.
want to just cut you off there, but wow.